And my answer to that question would be the best translation is the one you'll actually read, the translation that you will be willing to invest your time in and to take time to understand. You may have wondered before why we have so many different translations and versions of the Bible. And to answer that question in our modern context, it would be helpful for us to start back at the beginning with how the Bible originates. The Old Testament is written primarily in Hebrew, with some small portions that are written in Aramaic. And then the New Testament is written primarily in Greek, also containing a little bit of Aramaic as well. And this phenomenon of translation actually is something that begins in the process of the formation of the Bible itself. About 90% of the time, when New Testament authors are quoting from the Old Testament, they're actually quoting from a translation of the Hebrew text. This translation, which we refer to as the Septuagint, and was written around the 3rd or 2nd century BC, is sort of the go-to text for the New Testament authors as they interact with the Old Testament. So the reality of translation is something that's happening as the Bible develops in its origin. The Greek text largely informs the church for its first few centuries, as the early church uses both this Greek version of the Old Testament and the Greek New Testament for its readings of Scripture. But eventually, the Latin Vulgate develops, which is translated by Jerome. And we see over time this sort of gravitation between these two wings of the church during this period, where the Western church gives preference to the Latin text and the Eastern church gives preference to the Greek. And largely, these two versions of Scripture are what dominate until we really see an explosion of translation, particularly related to the English language, which develops in the medieval period. You may be familiar with names like Wycliffe and Tyndale, who were some of the early English translators of the Bible. And that sort of work of translation eventually culminates in what may be the most famous translation of the Bible, which is the King James Version, which is completed in 1611. And the main difference that we would see if we were to compare, for example, the NIV translation with the King James would be not only an updating of the language due to developments that have happened in English over those 300 or 400 years, but also different manuscripts that are used as the basis of those texts. The King James Version is based upon a manuscript family we sometimes refer to as the Byzantine text. And since that translation work, over the last few centuries, there are just many more manuscripts that have been discovered that give us earlier readings of the text. Our modern translations are based upon what we would refer to as an eclectic form of the text, meaning that this work that we call textual criticism is happening, where scholars and translators are comparing these different manuscripts in order to determine what is our earliest and therefore most reliable reading of the text. We also see differences between our translations. In addition to these manuscript differences and updating of language, with translation philosophy in general. We sometimes refer to these three major approaches to translation, which are formal equivalent, dynamic or functional equivalent, and paraphrase. In a formal equivalent translation, something like the NASB, the translators are really trying to match the grammatical details of the Greek text with the grammatical details of the translation being produced. But one of the challenges that this creates for the reader is that Greek and English are not the same. And the closer you stick to the ordering and structure of the Greek text, the less understandable your English translation is going to be. So a translation approach like functional or dynamic equivalence would be more the approach of the NIV, where they are trying to communicate the thought of the text without necessarily sticking to the grammatical structures. We also see that the target audience of a translation can influence how a translation is produced. Just for comparison, a translation like the NASB or the ESV is really geared more towards a high school educated reader, someone who has pretty good proficiency at reading English, whereas the NIV or the NLT is written more at a middle school level, and the NIRV even written at an elementary school level. So the proficiency of the reader is taken into consideration by translators who are working on these different translations. There are also theological influences that go into translation. And we see some of the major translations that are read today are informed by different theological traditions. The King James Version originally arose out of the Anglican tradition. The ESV was primarily produced by Reformed Protestant translators, and the CSB was a translation produced largely under direction of Baptist translators. And those different traditions can influence how translators are translating the text. We might compare that again with the NIV, which is more of a global evangelical translation, or even the NRSV, which is more ecumenical and involving a broader stream of traditions among its translators. And translators will also then consider how globally accessible they want their translation to be. Are they focused in, let's say, American English, or do they want an English that's going to be more broadly and easily read across the globe? So these different advances in knowledge and scholarship are largely the explanation for why we see so many different translations today, and different traditions and philosophies and even target audiences can influence how a translation is produced. And this may be raising the question for you, well, which is the best translation? Or which one should I read? And my answer to that question would be the best translation is the one you'll actually read, the translation that you will be willing to invest your time in and to take time to understand. And as you study Scripture, comparing these different translations, which all have their own advantages and disadvantages, can be a really helpful practice in you getting the most out of all of these wonderful resources of translation that are available to us today.